For those of you I've never met before, my name is Jennifer Krasinski. I'm on faculty here, and I wanted to welcome you on behalf of myself and David Levi Strauss to this evening's event, which we are very, very excited to host Lynne Tillman and Adam Pendleton this evening. For those of you who don't know Lynne or Adam, and I don't imagine there are many of you, just a brief introduction. Lynne Tillman writes novels, short stories, and nonfiction. Her novel No Lease on Life was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Fiction, and her essay collection, What Would Lynne Tillman Do?, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism. Her writing appears often in artist books and museum catalogs, including, most recently, those of Raymond Pettibone, Joan Jonas, Cindy Sherman, and Carol Dunham. She was a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and a Creative Capital Warhol Foundation grant for arts writing. And in addition, she is a professor, writer-in-residence at the University of Albany. And I'm very pleased and proud to say that she also teaches here in the MFA art writing program where you are right now. How the evening will go is that Lynne is going to read from her new book, and then she and Adam will have a conversation. And to introduce Adam for you, he is a conceptual artist known for his multidisciplinary practice, which moves fluidly between painting, publishing, photographic collage, video, and performance. His work centers on an engagement with language, in both the figurative and literal senses, and the recontextualization of history through appropriated imagery to establish alternative interpretations of the present, and, as the artist has explained, and I quote, a future dynamic where new historical narratives and meanings can exist. And with that, I welcome both Lynne and Adam.
So Adam will come up after I do my reading, and I thought I would start from the beginning, and not read the whole thing, of course, but I'd start now and several days later. Because, as we often say, we fiction writers, that we don't want it to bleed from both ends. You know, when you read from the middle of a novel where from which people haven't read anything, they might get lost. Or that's not a bad thing to do when you're reading, but in any case, I thought I'd start you out at the beginning. So this is from the beginning of Men and Apparitions. Prologue. The end doesn't depend on the beginning, it upends beginnings and also provokes new ones. If the end comes, it's to one person and could spark beginnings in others. The beginning starts in history not as a single event, though every birth is singular and every death also. But death and birth repeat themselves the way history does until no one remembers. And that's a quote from Ezekiel H. Stark, our protagonist narrator. And then there are different sections in this book rather than chapters. Self-narration or wildness of origin myths. The universe heaves with laughter, and I'm all about my lopsided, self-defining tale. How I came to be me, not you. How I'm shaping me for you, the way my posse and other native informants do for me. How I'm shape-shifting. I'm telling you that I'm telling you. Myself is my field, and habitually I observe and write field notes. Ethnographer, study yourself. Ethnographer, heal yourself. There was a no time with timeouts a long time ago, way before now. Space and time on a continuum, bend in relationship, and I imagine that soon I will, in some sense, return to the past whenever I want. Routine settles, creeps in. I've performed the same acts for 38 years, like eating breakfast. You were eating breakfast, you have been eating breakfast. You are conjugating breakfast ever since your mother set food before you. And now you're feeding yourself, only if you shop for it. Or maybe you went back to the land to raise it, but not everything you don't and can't raise everything. I was damn fortunate. Meals appeared regularly. I'm no ingrate. That was part of my home. You were spoon-fed, and it landed plop on the floor. Or you the baby, threw it, bad boy. Throw a tantrum, make a mess. Soon you have to clean it up. Break it, buddy. It's yours in pieces because you are responsible. And true, things go to pieces when not actually broken. Abstractions get broken. Ideas get broken. I have seen the best minds of my gen, me talking about the flawed life generally. Going to sleep, that gets tired. The regularity. And boredom might cause my chronic insomnia. So it's cool when you don't know you're falling asleep. Then you wake up and the TV is on. You open your eyes, weird. To dream becomes the best reason to sleep, especially if you do, I do, conscious dreaming, and get to choose. A dream becomes a podcast or movie. Otherwise, nightmares pit REM sleep with terror. I listened to a podcast of an old TV news program and heard a Soviet and Russian historian, Stephen Cohen, argue with a total jerk. Completely exasperated by the fool, Cohen finally said, "With all due respect, you don't know what you're talking about." I swallowed the moment like a hallucinogen. That's so fucking rare. It tears up Max Weber's cage. That's my goal, to tear it up, me especially. I don't get high anymore. Antidepressants keep me sort of level and don't combine well with recreational drugs. Living drug-free is a sort of high, except clarity can get ugly. My analyst suggests that I elongated my kidhood by delaying leaving home. No big deal, really typical. I suffer from abulia, which my analyst says is an abnormal lack of ability to act or make decisions. I like the word. So I say to my analyst, abulia, I'm another Hamlet. Look what happened to him. I dither, weigh both sides, make lists, advantages, disadvantages. Picture me in a frame, framed. My frame of reference is cultural anthropology. Clifford Geertz says that doing ethnography is like trying to read in the sense of constructing a reading of a manuscript. That culture is public because meaning is. I do ethnography by working with photographs, also with the human absorption in images, and with the many forms and senses of image, creating an image, loving an image, etc. My specialty, family photographs. Images don't mean as words mean, though people and I apply words to them. Photographs can create images, but they are not images per se. They are things, a physical object. An image doesn't have to be based on a photograph. It is a mind picture, or an image is a picture in the mind. A photograph may inspire or foment an image or images. An image is a concoction often manufactured, meant to create a way to be seen, viewed, understood. It can be airy-fairy, a phantom, phantasm. Can an image built out of self-consciousness lie? I wear a brimless hat because it's cool. Does it tell a lie about me? I take a photograph, I don't take an image. Unless I'm a vampire. Vampires don't look like the ones on TV. The living dead are regular people who suck you dry. A mind is not a brain. A brain is to a mind what a photograph is to an image. And they can be conflated, brains and minds, images and photographs, and sometimes I do it too. Virginia Woolf, Mother's fave, says that words also can't be pinned down. Quote, words do not live in dictionaries. They hate anything that stamps them with one meaning or confines them to one attitude, for it is their nature to change. It is because the truth they try to catch is many-sided, and they convey it by being themselves many-sided, flashing this way, then that. Thus they mean one thing to one person, another thing to another person, unquote. But a photograph doesn't own even a wayward dictionary, though semioticians work it, finding ways to read one. Even vertiginously, words have definitions, to name and rename objects in a cascade of tautologies. A synonym loops, loop-de-loops. The antique game of telephone, the last to hear, in a string of listeners will hear, an entirely different story from the first. Looking can be benign or malevolent. Looking entails everything human. and our instinct to look keeps us close to our evolutionary partners and antecedents in crime and development. If a deer spies a human, it will determine its level of threat. A deer runs if an unknown creature gets closer than what it perceives as safe. And deer are stupid, nice to look at, but dumb as doors. Now, people are stealthier in their observations, but the same principle applies, the need to clock others. A stranger enters a room, a group of familiars note her or him, no one enters a room, no one moves a second, 30 seconds pass until one brave familiar strides across the floor to the door. The stranger introduces himself, and the familiar brings the stranger into the room, and soon others come closer and sort of sniff him. If no one moves toward the door, stasis, unless the stranger boldly enters and quickly identifies himself. I'm Michael, Donald's friend. Imagine if the person entered but didn't identify himself. Discomfort would be fierce. Who is a perfect stranger? Is there a complete stranger? I'm just trying to find different parts of this that kind of show different things. Domestic visuals, too, T-O-O. I was totally conscious as a little kid of life passing. And when I saw a brilliant fall leaf hanging from a tree about to drop, seeing it from a car window, I thought, I'll never see that leaf again, and felt sad. And I don't know why, at 4 years old, I felt such loss. In our family's albums, leaves were glued on pages, leaves, or set under plastic, and maybe I experienced something like D.W. Winnicott's holding, in quotes. Far from consciousness, the ephemeral was transformed into a document that turned into a monument to memory and, in quotes, truth. There it was, mother as a girl. Samuel Beckett says, all art is the same, an attempt to fill an empty space. I'd lost nothing that I was aware of, only what everyone loses when the amniotic sac bursts and you, fetus, drop, get pushed through a tight vaginal canal and thrust into unexpected environs. We didn't know. Now, always trying to fill the emptiness. I spend hours, weeks, months from my young life on with pictures, absorbed by their mysteriousness. There, yet not there. What is there? Now I'll jump into the middle. Somewhere. The book bounces around. This novel bounces around. A boy, a shutterbug. With my starter guy, I shot trees, flowers, clouds, cloudless skies where great Uncle Ezekiel and Uncle Lionel might be rocking. The little disc camera did everything automatically, but I shot out of focus because I moved the camera. I liked blurs, unformed things like me. I wasn't into the mechanics of cameras, lenses, focal length, speed, just the imagination behind the camera, me. I was engaged in me, what was before me, which became a strange ownership, probably symptomatic or evidence of a little person's pride in what he believes he controls. Silly tot. Later, when Father allowed it, I fooled around with his Polaroid cameras. Dad knew Land, its inventor, personally, or I thought he had to, the way he talked about him in his camera. John Maurice Stark bought every Polaroid camera that came to market, top of the line. Each time, the newest version was sleeker, flatter, faster. Polaroid collapsed, past, present, future, and started me up. Collapsing past, present, future, waiting for it. I live that. We live unaccountably with time. Time does damage. I can't account for my time. No one can. Time just goes on, and humans are left alone, wondering what the fuck they're doing in the here and now. Academia. Scholars fall for their objects of study and nurture them, their childhood dreams. When I'm grown up, I'm gonna be. Few of them know why their interest becomes a passion, a purpose, a mania. Biographers relinquish their own lives absorbed in another's for years. I might want to analyze a person who does that. Wonder if they're a class or type, discernible. Necro-image love, my term, has its advocates, Edgar Allan Poe, for one. English professors and historians et al. Profess a love for their period, their person, usually dead. My hymns are hers, they say. And these enunciations reek of scholarly necrophilia. Professors may also closely mimic and style their self-proclaimed soulmates when listening to them at conferences as they talk about their subjects, Marilyn Monroe, Lincoln, Tupac Shakur, Marx, Sappho, Emerson, Whitman, Virginia Woolf, Steve Jobs. I hear their urgent claims for their idols. Scholarship, a facade for image worship and identification. Image worship thrives because of distance and lack of actual contact. A pseudo-intimacy relies on distance because to be close while far, intimate but remote, makes any relationship possible. The other, in quotes, has no way out. In his bio of Jean Genet, Edmund White admitted that his subject would not like him. Like operating a zoom lens, people at a distance own the ability to be close, maybe to what shouldn't be allowed near, which again exalts and exaggerates people's position in the universe to themselves, runs the grandiosity engine big time. In my field, I didn't have that kind of love. True, I was all about Geertz and Jean Rouche's anthro movies, cool stuff. Cultural anthropologists do have favorite tribes, clubs, gangs. Thriving on multiples is dope. And years ago, one of them might have extolled, quote unquote, his pygmies. Pathology is where so-called sanity also is. Family matters, the matter. Mother probably knows if Clarissa has or ever had sexual feelings. She registers as several gender identities, but I can't imagine her lusting after anyone. My imagination is limited. She has always lived near her adored baby sister and also is close to little sister, who's his younger sister. Clarissa doesn't disdain brother Hart, who's his older brother, because he, though male, became a medical doctor. A hypochondriac tolerates doctors while despising their expertise. After his book, You're a Picture, You're Not a Picture, was published, Brother Hart turned uglier, more brutal in his attempts at one-upmanship. Hotshot academic, he sneered. I mean, like Snidely Whiplash. Totally ridiculous Hart. A constitutionally weak sadist. No cojones. The story goes, Hart was 4, I was a newborn, he entered mother's bedroom, she was breastfeeding me, and the little boy, like a storm, raged, leaped at me, and I needed defense from his tiny fists. He has hated me since. That's the skinny. Those primitive furies, instincts, or good judgment. It could be a real high, messing up Hart's pictorial face. A borderline personality could do it, but why bother? I used to really believe Clarissa represented a dying breed, spinster, who stayed home close to kin. I don't think that now. Her type just morphed. No more spinsters, but another type of female. She prefers to live alone, not to be encumbered by a mate, male or female, doesn't want it. That, domesticity, wants love, sometimes but doesn't want someone else around. Blood tells, as a fact. Aunt Clarissa carries many of her lines' recessive traits. She's a trickster, or she's her own person. Either way. Thanks.
I had a vision in my head that there were going to be like 1,000 people here. So this is much better.
It's intimate.
It's intimate. I'm much more relaxed than I would have been otherwise. Thanks for having me tonight. And
I'm glad you could do it.
Yes. So I thought we'd start, I basically wrote some questions, and I thought we'd use them as a point of departure, at least to begin a kind of conversation about the book, because as you just said, it moves around a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of different things that we could talk about and a lot of different ways we could talk about them. So, Lynne, you
Yes.
once said in an interview, I begin nonfiction essays in a similar way to fiction. I have some questions in mind, things that I'm interested in writing about, and in fiction, I find a voice through which to do that. So, naturally, I think a good place to start is, what questions did you have in mind when you set out to write this book?
Well, we've all been using this sentence or phrase, we're living in a glut of images. And that's been said now for what, 40 years, 30 years? And I thought, as a novelist, I kind of think it's my job to narrate certain conditions in the way that I can do it. And I thought, well, how would you tell the story of someone living in a glut of images? And that is really where it began. And I had some other thoughts in mind about wanting to write from the point of view of a guy in his late 30s, mid to late 30s, who was heterosexual, who was a young man born under the sign of feminism and the post-women's movement. And I wanted to, the other side of feminism or feminisms is not only what happens to women, or however one wants to define that term, females, but what happens to males in this changed world. And so, and I had been noticing with friends of mine like you and other young men of different kinds of guys, that the way in which they were talking about their relationships with women and friendships were different from men in their 60s and even 50s, and of course older. And so I became very curious in how could I marry these, the idea of image and these young men and the effect on them of various kinds of feminism or feminisms, and I realized in part a lot of that had to do with image.
Yeah. So it's fair to say the images that Zeke contends with have changed on the one hand, but they're still influenced by a kind of historical consciousness or matter that he doesn't quite know what to do with.
Yeah, I think so. I think that he, I don't know if he exemplifies, but he represents some of that confusion in the midst of a lot of change that is more incremental than revolutionary, but change nonetheless. And I thought making him a cultural anthropologist gave me a lot of leeway to discuss social and cultural issues also. So I wanted to kill a lot of birds, although I love birds. I mean, what don't I love? I don't know, cockroaches with one.
So I read the book pretty much in one sitting.
Did you really?
I did.
That's amazing.
Well, I'm not the fastest reader, mostly because I tend to read passages multiple times and I take a lot of notes. So I actually got up at about 6:45 and read until about 9:15, but really straight through. And at a certain point, it was hard for me to distinguish my voice from Zeke's voice.
Oh, that's great.
But I ended up reading the last, I think, 3 or 4 pages out loud. And it was at that point I realized how particular and strange his voice actually was. So when it was sort of this internal process, I thought I got lost. And I realized that my way of thinking, of course, and speaking is actually very different, but literally after, nearly 400 pages. And I want to ask you, how would you describe Zeke's voice? What kind of image were you trying to create?
That's a good question because, of course, we think of voice as what gets spoken. But in a novel or a story, the voice is always inside one's head.
Yes.
So how do you interrupt the voice in your head or in the reader's head with the protagonist's voice? It's such a hard question. I mean, it's an excellent question, but it's very, very difficult to explain. I wanted him to kind of be both knowing and sometimes foolish and sometimes funny and serious. There's a certain cadence that his speaking, or he sounds like, he might sound like in one's head. But you represent here a very interesting question because it is what you are internalizing a voice when you're reading it. And so it's always inflected by your own in some way. I tried to pick language that I thought might identify him. And it's a funny thing with using contemporary words. You have to be, I think, very wary of doing that too much, because then it becomes sort of trendoid or something. Because it's not, I didn't want him to, I wanted to be of his time.
What's the contemporary word?
Oh, I used some in here. God, does anyone remember a contemporary word? Even cool.
Sure.
I now can, what? Dope, yes, yeah,
Right.
yeah. If I kept putting dope in or something like that, it would just be cloying, and it would be too much as if I were trying to signify the contemporary moment, which is always passing, right? It's contemporary is temporary. And, but you need just enough to help cite him somewhere. So we see he's of a certain generation, or he's of a certain part of a certain generation, because he doesn't represent everyone. And that's the other thing about writing a character. You're writing a specific person, a specific representation. You're not I wasn't trying to represent men.
Right. Just to quickly say, it was interesting how much of the book actually reads as a kind of a prose poem. For me at least, there's a kind of poetic quality because he's both foolish and wise, I mean, the book is full of fantastic one-lines, that you think, oh, I have to live like this, and then he carries on and he says something, terrible or atrocious, and you say, oh, I don't want to be this guy,
Right.
So you kind of, and it's funny because when he's wise, you say, oh, is that Lynne, and when he's stupid, you say,
oh, that must be Lynne.
So Zeke is preoccupied with the concept of family, personally and also professionally as an ethnographer. Early on in the book, he says his specialty is family photographs and family attitudes, though they aren't obvious, like rhythms and lyrics get beat into us.
Yeah.
His Aunt Clarissa did a lot of that beating, at least in terms of his mother's family history.
Yeah.
So speaking of family, I have this feeling that Zeke would have been a terrible father and probably, maybe, a terrible lover, but in a good way.
What's the good way of being terrible? I'd like to know.
A paradox, though, right?
I've always, that idea of someone being a good lover, when, it gets so-and-so's a good lover, I always think, well, what does that actually mean, because people can dispute that, right?
Well, he marries Maggie.
Yes.
And the relationship falls apart. You kind of, it's predictable on the one hand, right? Like, this guy has not had, everything hasn't gone right? He's not suit and tie, has a job, has a family, has a kid, and he's set. There's trouble.
Yes.
So before it happens, it's going to happen. Well, you also know if you just read if you read the flap of the book. Yeah. But you don't quite know why.
Right.
You never, other than sort of thinking about what's come before, and then when you continue on past the sort of trauma of the relationship breaking up, maybe he was the wrong image. Maybe he and Maggie together didn't create what she perceived or he perceived even as a kind of productive image.
Yes, that's in his mind.
Yes, that's very much so in his mind. So what I mean to say when I say that he was probably a terrible lover, would be a terrible father, is that he would show us something about ourselves in those kinds of relationships, in that kind of dynamic.
That's interesting because he meets Maggie early on in college, and so he's with her through his 20s, or almost through his 20s, and he's never really loved anyone before, or he feels that he hasn't ever been loved before. And I've never in a novel done something like this. I don't want to tell you too much because you haven't read it, but I've never had this kind of emphasis on a relationship that when it falls apart has a tremendous effect on what happens to a character in the next half of the book. I'd never done that before, and I was very curious whether I could do it. I tried to leave clues or write clues into, for instance, his relationship with his little sister, and her being selectively mute. Everyone in the family has a problem of some kind. The brother, the pathologist whom Zeke hates and who hates Zeke, they're 4 years apart, has a fear of being buried alive, for instance. His younger sister, whom he always calls little sister, is selectively mute. In certain circumstances, she cannot speak at all. And his love of his younger sister, of little sister, his interest in silence, and then he also, there's a whole section in which he's talking about John Cage. And see, I was trying to put together all of these things that might seem theoretical, but that come from also are psychological. Why do we choose to make the work we do? Why do we choose, we don't really choose to think what we do, but we seem to make choices.
I think, at least by bringing up Cage, this kind of leads into the next question I wanted to ask you. You've written quite a lot about contemporary art and contemporary artists for many years. And Zeke is a kind of casual art critic. His parents took him to museums. He's in the know, right? Which also poses its own kind of problems in a strange way. So he looks at art critically and relates it in various ways to his professional endeavors and pursuits. And art shapes his relationship to images, but he makes a kind of distinction between an image an artist makes, a snapshot, a selfie.
Right.
He's very particular, even though he is simply, quite frankly, overwhelmed by images. It's really a kind of a crisis, actually. Yet, when his sister dies, there's a break, a shift, which I felt almost occurred when he went to visit the statue of Clover Adams, his distant relative at the Rock Creek Cemetery
Right.
in D.C., which has a great title, The Mystery of the Hereafter and the Peace of God That Passeth Understanding. But it's after his sister, and I don't know if I'm giving something away, but this is not TV, so I can give it away. His sister, Matilda, little sister, dies, he says, because a photograph proves nothing, even though you're careful to make a distinction between an image and a photograph. But he says, so because a photograph proves nothing, and then just after that, he says that he is Ezekiel Stark, former image investigator. What questions do we need to ask? What can we ask of images? I'm asking you now, but these are questions you touch on, you address within the book, but it's a kind of a death that for him of images, how they have function, how they do function, that occurs after his sister passes away.
Right. He's been, the death of his relationship with his wife, Maggie, and then the death of his little sister. Everything, in a sense, breaks down, falls apart. What he believed, he can no longer believe. He cannot trust in his sense of expertise. He's never been uncritical of anthropology, but I think he had more feeling that he could think using that frame, think through things, and then
which is a kind of emotional distance as
yes,
well. Of
that's
course.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. Just the way taking a photograph can
Right.
be an emotional distance.
Yeah.
And why the zoom lens is so interesting to me. It's a very peculiar thing to be able to make things very close that are much farther away. I mean, it's just that we can do that, and that we wanted to do that is so interesting.
Yeah.
Such an interesting phenomenon. Things. That is a good question, Adam. What do we expect of images? Certainly, we know that they don't document things in the way that we thought at the birth of photography that they would. I mean, photographic images. What can we do? We read into images. Or have them in our minds based on a photograph, for instance. But the photograph isn't an image it is also a physical object, it is a thing.
It seems as though, I mean, if we read or regard these different sort of seminal relationships that he has in his life as a kind of an image, even the relationship he has with his sister, the relationship he has with his mother, the relationship he has with Brohart,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. But it seems as though he gets closer to life, to living, when these images die. So it's actually, in an interesting way, it's when he breaks up with Maggie and he goes off to Germany and he meets this older painter. And at least in how it is written, what we actually get from the page, they don't really talk.
No.
They just sort of coexist. They're around each other.
Right.
But they're not even really we don't even really get the sense that they're even observing each other intensely.
Right.
But it is that sort of encounter that leads to, at least in the space of the book, the first time someone says, "I love you." So when he gets on the train,
Well, that's such a good point.
the
yes.
guy says, "I love you. I believe I love you like my son."
That's right. That's right. Wow, that's such an amazing point, because I hadn't realized that it's. He talks about loving Maggie, but he never says to her, nor does she say to him, "I love you." How interesting. Well, it's really a fantastic thought, Adam, and I think that statement and the idea that in this period where there isn't that much talking, it is a little bit just thinking about it like Little Sister, because
Right.
there's nothing,
a kind
I think,
of a screen.
that's right. I think there's nothing more beautiful in some ways than to be in a space with someone and feel you don't have to talk. And it's a curious form of love, isn't it?
Yes.
To just share a space and not make a demand on another.
Yes.
And not to feel demanded of. And I think that's what happens to him. This older painter gives him this space not to, in which he doesn't have to say anything or do anything.
Yes, it allows him to build himself back up.
Right.
So which kind of, and I sort of asked the question, and maybe this is an unfair question, but I ask it in relationship to this idea of photography. And I've always thought that photography represents a peculiar kind of death of a moment, of an idea, of a resemblance, or it's death, essentially. But so I wonder if you could answer, how does the death of an image activate life?
Of the importance of the image.
Perhaps, yes.
Yeah.
That's yeah.
Well, in the novel, I argue with Bart a little bit on and Sontag on the idea that photography always means death, because I sort of brought in reader response theory, which actually is what Bart is saying about writing, that the death of the capital A author is the birth of the reader. So I was theorizing through Zeke that why is it a photograph always represents death if the person looking at it is alive? And so if you begin to think about that relationship, then it changes perhaps how we should think about pictures, because we are interpreting a picture, whether or not that picture says that. You see, that's the problem. I mean, time was when you had documentary photography that said, this is what this is. You have Lewis Hine saying, these are poor people, or, but that's now very questionable, what we're really photographing. And we say this is a poor person, this is a minority person, we're supposed to look at this with, we assume sympathy, but then that calls into question whether or not you're giving any agency to the people in the picture at all, and doesn't that make them, re-victimize them?
Well, you know, it's funny how you sort of raise our consciousness in regards to agency through death, through suicide. So basically the ultimate agency, you know, saying, I don't have to be here, I don't have to live here, I'm done. Little Sister, Clover Adams, and you wonder where Zeke is headed in a strange way.
Right.
No,
we don't know.
we don't know. But the most interesting suicide is that Clover Adams kills herself by drinking photographic chemicals.
That's right. Can you think of anything more hideous? I can't. But Clover Hooper
Not efficient.
Clover Hooper Adams was a 19th century character, and she was married to Henry Adams, the historian and of that great family. And she was a very well-born, you know, American version of aristocrat.
And her father was almost a new man, at least
that's right.
of his era.
Of his era, because her mother, who was a feminist and a poet, died when Clover was, and Clover's an actual person, she died when Ellen was her name, Ellen Sturgis died when Clover was only 5. And so she was raised by a father, and both she and her sister were sent to very good schools. The father had them educated in ways that girls of that time, even high-born girls, were not educated. So he was a very enlightened man. And in the last 3 years of her life, she started taking photographs. Her father was an ophthalmologist also, which I just kind of love. So the eye is so important. But so she went against the grain by becoming a professional photographer. And Henry Adams, who was had a great mind. He was a terrific writer and all of this. He was very ambivalent about the intelligence of women, which is disturbing.
Yes, he said she couldn't spell, even though
right.
she clearly could spell.
Yeah. She wrote these amazing
She wrote
letters,
but she can't spell.
That's right.
Ignore her. To get back to a kind of a more concrete sort of process, which oriented perhaps, which I think is sort of interesting. I was struck by the speed or how delayed details were revealed. Names, dates, etc. So you're reading the whole book, you're hearing about his mother, but maybe 200 pages later you find out her name is Ellen, which begs the question, can you structure a narrative, or is it always a futile endeavor, even when everything appears to be in order or on track?
Wow, that's a concrete question.
Yeah.
Wow. Can one structure a narrative? Well, you choose. The narrative is always a question of order. And this narrative in particular, because there are many segments to it, could be reordered.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And that drove me crazy.
Yeah.
At one point I had so many different versions that I wasn't sure where I was, and I actually hired a really terrific reader, Elizabeth Shamblin, who's an art critic. She's at Art Forum, a senior editor there. If she would read it and try to explain to me how many times I was repeating something or whatever, I got so confused because of the possibility of these parts moving around. In Hollywood, they talk about the through line and all of this. I just had Zeke's voice, basically. I had Zeke telling his story. I had him having certain interests and relationships that I thought by accretion and accumulation would be the story. And I always thought from the beginning that I wanted everything to fall apart in a way. And for us not to know what will happen with him.
Right.
Although he has been working on a study of men his own age. There's a part of
it's
the
almost
book.
like it's sort of a deconstructed memoir,
Right.
in a way.
That's a funny way to put it, but I think that's true, yeah.
A few more questions two more before we let other people ask questions. And this is almost it is a climactic moment in the book, and I'm curious what it signifies, if anything. But the question is, what's in a name? And that is the reason why I'm asking, is because I was really struck when little sister finally says to Zeke, "I'm Tilda Zeke, don't call me little sister."
Right, that's right. Well, she's separating herself from his image of the family. You were talking about that before. She's making herself distinct from the way in which he has his narrative of the family. I have two older sisters. I'm sure all of you who are not only children have, that sounds weird, or the only one in your family who is a child or something like that. But if you talk, is the only child of your parents, that you will, your version of what goes on in that family is so different. From my older sisters, very, very different. And so Zeke's version of who his sister is not her version of who she is. And so when she says, well, it makes me think of Glenn Ligon's work based on the march in I Am a Man.
Sure, right.
She's saying, I am Tilda, I'm not little sister. I think that kind of naming, and it's the only time that happens in the book also, come to think of it.
It's funny because so Glenn did the I Am Not a Man.
I Am a Man.
I Am a Man, excuse me. And then he did the later piece where another kind of a protest where he actually whites out everything on the banners. And I've always thought of them in relationship to each other, as though they were made in relationship to each other.
Yes.
This sort of anonymity, and then on the flip of it, someone claiming, but yet I am human. But a kind of anonymity actually claims a humanistic space in a way, in a strange way.
By whiting it over?
By saying you are a part of everyone.
That's right.
In a way.
Yeah.
Which is whiting it over, kind of, you're no longer specific, you're a part of everything.
Right.
In a
I
way.
always thought that the whiting it over had to do with the erasure by white people of black people.
Yes, that's probably a more productive read. But
I don't know.
mine is maybe
But you don't want it to
perverse
have one
and
meaning. Yeah, yours is
perverse
quite
and
perverse,
utopic.
That's right.
perversely utopic.
Right.
So the last section of the book, Men in Quotes, a field study, is rather different than the sections that preceded,
Right.
or at least it hit me that way. Though Zeke's voice is still unmistakably his own. How did that section come about? It seems like it's its own project, a part of a potentially larger investigation or mode of inquiry and or body of language.
I wanted him, I thought, well, he's an ethnographer, I need to do an ethnographic study. And because of my interest in this young man born under the sign of feminism and the post-women's movement and so on, I wanted an examination of these kinds of guys. And I thought, well, I would have Zeke do it. And I didn't want to make up voices other than his. So I sent an email survey to about 30 guys of different ages, a couple of trans men, one bisexual, one gay, and sent off the rest, it's primarily white heterosexual guys, but not only. I sent out general questions like, what is your relationship to your father? How do you think you're different from him? What do you expect from women? What do you think they expect from you? A couple of other questions. So the big questions. And now it's a small, tiny subset of.
Sure.
But they're all intelligent and interested in the questions, and sent back the most extraordinarily interesting answers to me about their lives and their relationship to their father or their mother, and what their father was like from their point of view, how they're different, how they're not. And so I had a lot more material than I actually used, because it could have been 200,
Sure.
300 pages.
It seemed that
Yeah.
way, yeah.
And he interpolates,
Yes.
because he is measuring himself against
Right.
them. And
you feel that, and even though he says subject 23, subject 1, you feel he's claiming space for himself within all of these responses.
in some way, yes. Yeah, that's true. So using actual subjects was really interesting. I've done that in a couple of other books, but in this I did it most broadly, I could say, or the longest version of that.
Yeah. Thank you, Lynne. It's a marvelous book.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Well, I knew I had to have pictures in there because he's thinking about pictures. It didn't make any sense to put a novel out with no pictures, and I found the bulk of the family photographs in a store in Hudson, New York, and in 2 big shopping bags full of one family's pictures from probably the 40s and 50s, and they were very small little pictures, and in those little booklets that photo places used to produce. And it was a fantastic moment in terms of, I can use this in my novel. I mean, I had collected pictures over the years, but nothing
I
as.
think you emailed me asking for a picture.
That's right, and it's
which
in there.
was strange that I don't have any. I didn't send you one.
No, you didn't send
I
me
don't
one.
have
That's
any.
right. Yes, I've forgotten
No,
it.
I'm not photographed. No, no I'm kidding.
Yes, that was very. Yes, you really didn't have
I
any.
really didn't know. I didn't.
You said something about maybe your mother had some, but you weren't going to see her or something like that. Anyway, that was peculiar. But we'll have to discuss that another time. But so there were those, and a friend of mine, told me he collected photographs off the street, the things that were thrown away. So I was able to have Zeke talk about throwaways. He talks about photographs that are just thrown away. But also the idea that you had a whole family's history, and that they had been thrown away, that there was no relative or somebody who wanted them, was also a kind of sad fact of life, right? What do these photographs mean? That they were not kept, no one wanted them, or there was nobody to have them.
No one left.
And then, so for instance, because Clover Hooper Adams was herself a photographer, there's a picture that she took in there of Henry Adams on their honeymoon, which was a very interesting moment in their early year together. And a picture of where she is memorialized. Stanford White did the monument, and Augustus St. Gaudens did the statue, which is called, the shortened version is just called Grief. And it's very beautiful of her. So I forget what other, and then when I finished the more narrative part of the novel, although there are little narratives in Men in Quotes, because these are these young men talking about their lives, I realized I wanted, and I was thinking of one of Virginia Woolf's books, To the Lighthouse. And I thought there had to be a passage that one went from the end of this major narrative or whatever so-called narrative novel to this Men in Quotes. And that's when I decided I wanted to have a gallery of images of contemporary men's pictures of themselves when they were boys or young men, as a kind of movement through to Men in Quotes, to the study. Motion sickness works with coincidence. And I was really interested, and it's not sequential, it's associational. That's one difference. This, even though it's not ordered necessarily chronologically, not all of it anyway, there is a narrative that goes through a voice from Zeke's voice, sort of telling his own story in a kind of chronological way, even if the theoretical parts could be placed in other places. I couldn't do that with Motion Sickness or in Cast in Doubt, my next novel. All of the structures in all of my novels are quite different. And that's part of what interests me in writing them. It's both the idea and how I can formally do something different from what I did last. Oh, I'm glad you like Motion Sickness. Thank you. Okay, so.
Great.
Oh, Adam, isn't he great?
Thank you.
And I can sign some books if you want.